So here's something that blows my mind. Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy who conquered most of Europe, had a standing arrangement with his wine merchants to make sure he had a bottle of one specific Burgundy available to him at all times, even on the battlefield, even in Russia. He brought crates of this wine with him into one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history. Winston Churchill, he drank so much champagne that when he died, the house that made it put a black border around their labels as a sign of mourning. They still make a wine named after him. And Kim Jong-il, the dictator presiding over a country of starving people, well, he was spending over $500,000 a year on French cognac. He was the single largest individual customer of Hennessy on the planet. Welcome. I'm John. Power has always had a drink in its hand. Today, I want to tell you what was in the glass and what those choices tell us about those wines, the people, and the history behind them. So, let's start with the founding father who might have loved wine more than democracy. Thomas Jefferson arrived in Paris in 1784 as America's minister to France. By 1787, he finagled a 3-month tour through the wine regions of southern France and northern Italy, Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhone, Piedmont. The man was supposed to be doing diplomacy with America's most important ally, France. Instead, he was doing wine tourism. And he was obsessive about it. He walked the vineyards, he talked to the vigneron, he talked to those growers. And he took notes on everything, on the soil and the exposure, the yields, the prices. And he ranked the wines of Bordeaux and Burgundy decades before any official classification existed. His favorites? Chateau Lafite, Chateau d'Yquem, Haut-Brion, Meursault, Montrachet. He was buying the best wines in the world before anyone in America had even heard of them. He stocked the White House cellar when he became president. He advised Washington, he advised Adams, Madison, and Monroe on what to serve at state dinners. In fact, he spent so much money on wine that it contributed to the financial ruin that haunted his final years. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, he died broke, and wine, it was a significant part of the reason. And here's the kicker. He tried to grow wine at Monticello. He planted European vines, and they all died, every single last one. Jefferson dreamed of American wine for decades, and he never actually made a single bottle. Today, there are nearly 300 wineries in Virginia, including one right on his original property. He was right. He was just 200 years too early. Oh, and a footnote. In 1985, a bottle, supposedly from Jefferson's personal collection, sold at Christie's for $156,000. It was engraved with 1787 Lafite and the initials THJ. Turned out to be a fake, sold by a German collector named Hardy Rodenstock. The fraud was eventually exposed when experts discovered the initials had been engraved with modern power tools that didn't exist in the 18th century. Billionaire Bill Koch, he spent roughly $400,000 on 4 of these bottles, and he eventually sued. The most expensive wine fraud in history, and it started with Jefferson. Even after his death, the man was still generating wine content. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a drinker, so let's get that right out of the way. By all accounts, he spent about 20 minutes on meals, he had simple tastes, and he diluted his wine with water, sometimes half and half. He was not sitting around savoring a Grand Cru, but he did have one wine. One wine he drank every single day for 15 years. One wine he brought to Egypt, to Russia, to every campaign, Chambertin. He first tasted it as a young artillery student at the academy in Ozon, which is in Burgundy, and he fell for it. His wine merchants, a firm called Soup de Périgord, made a deal with him. They said, "We will make sure that there is a bottle of 5 to 6 year old Chambertin available wherever he was." So on the battlefield, their sons would personally follow the emperor to make sure that that supply didn't run out. There's even this lovable myth that when units of Napoleon's Grand Armée marched through the Côte d'Or, they had to present arms when they passed a Grand Cru vineyard. A military salute to a field of grapes. Unverified, but absolutely amazing to imagine. And when he was finally exiled to St. Helena after Waterloo, the Chambertin, it couldn't survive the journey. The bottles, they turned to vinegar in the tropical heat. So, Napoleon drank claret, Bordeaux, which just traveled much easier and much better, but he never really loved it quite the same way. And he discovered a sweet wine from South Africa called Constantia. And it's a muscat from the Cape. And he had 30 bottles shipped to him every month until he died. Constantia became Napoleon's last wine, and that wine is still made today. So if Napoleon was a reluctant drinker who happened to love warm wine, Winston Churchill was the opposite. Churchill drank with purpose, with enthusiasm, and with staggering volume. His quote about champagne is one of the most famous in wine: "In victory, you deserve it. In defeat, you need it." His champagne was Pol Roger. He first drank it in 1908, and he remained loyal to it for the rest of his life. He reportedly consumed an imperial pint of it at lunch and another at dinner every single day. Now, to be clear, that's about a bottle and a half of champagne daily. He named a racehorse Pol Roger, and when he was asked about his relationship with alcohol, he said, "My tastes are simple. I am easily satisfied with the best." But the best part of this story isn't Churchill. It's Odette. It's November 1944 at a lunch in the British Embassy in Paris just after liberation. The ambassador, Duff Cooper, who knew Churchill loved beautiful women as much as he loved champagne, seated Odette Pol Roger next to him. Now, she was the wife of Jacques Pol Roger, the founder's grandson, and their friendship was immediate. Their very close platonic bond lasted 21 years until Churchill's death. It was, as the writer Susan Mary Alsop described it, a beautiful December-May relationship, quite harmless and smiled upon by Mrs. Churchill. When he died in 1965, the Pol Roger family placed a black border around the labels of every bottle of Brut. All these that went to the United Kingdom had this special black box as a special sign of mourning for a customer. Think about that. A champagne house changed its label because one man died, and they kept that black border until 1990. In 1984, they released Cuvée Sir Winston Churchill, their prestige bottling, unveiled at Blenheim Palace, which was Churchill's birthplace. The exact blend is a family secret, but it's known to be dominated by Pinot Noir, reflecting what Churchill loved: robustness, structure, maturity. It's one of the great champagnes in the world, and you can still buy it today. Now we go somewhere a little bit darker because, of course, wine doesn't just attract lovers, it attracts looters. When Germany invaded France in 1940, one of the very first things the Nazi leadership targeted was the wine. In the very first weeks of the occupation, soldiers stole over 2 million bottles from the Champagne region alone. Restaurants with legendary cellars like La Tour de Jean in Paris, they were raided. They seized around 80,000 bottles from La Tour de Jean, though the staff there managed to hide the most precious vintages behind a false wall before the soldiers arrived. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was the most voracious collector among the Nazi elite. His personal wine cellar in Berlin would eventually hold thousands of bottles of the most expensive French wines in existence. His favorite? Chateau Lafite Rothschild. The irony of a Nazi leader hoarding wine from the Rothschild estate was apparently completely lost on him. The Nazis didn't just loot randomly. They created a system. So they appointed officials that were called Weinführers. These were the wine leaders. And each of these Weinführers had a major wine region. They were often German wine merchants, and so they knew the French producers personally through generations of doing business together. And their job was to ensure the best wines were shipped to Berlin, to the Nazi elite, and to feed the war machine. Now, the champagne houses complied, but they resisted in subtle ways. So they'd send inferior wines with prestigious labels, they hid their best bottles behind false walls, and then the end. May 1945. Allied troops raced to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. French soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division arrived first, and they found over 500,000 bottles in the cellar. Among the forces was a man named Bernard de Nonancourt. He was a young soldier with deep ties in the Champagne region and the house of Laurent Perrier. Inside the cellar, he found cases of 1928 Ceylon champagne, bottles connected to his own family business, which the Germans had looted years earlier. The French soldiers, they dumped water from their canteens and they started filling them up with wine. Now, meanwhile, the Americans found Göring's personal stash. Now, that was about 16,000 bottles. On May 7th, the day Germany signed its surrender, the contents of that cellar were distributed to the companies of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry, 1 truckload per company. American paratroopers who had just defeated the Nazis were double-fisting $1,000 bottles of Bordeaux. As one historian put it, who is more deserving of $1 million hangover? Some of Göring's collection was sent to Russia when Berlin fell. So 129 bottles ended up in Krikova cellar in Moldova. And they are actually still there today. And you could take a visit if you'd like. This pattern didn't end with the Nazis. The 20th and 21st centuries are full of dictators with expensive taste in wine. And starving populations, those are the ones who paid for it. Let's talk about Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was Georgian, and he never lost his love for Georgian wine and cuisine. So he hosted these marathon dinners, and they would last 6 hours. They had elaborate menus, and they had rivers of alcohol. But here's the twist. Stalin maintained strict control over his own consumption. So he drank white wine, which looked kind of like vodka, while encouraging his guests to down the hard stuff, loosening up their tongues. He watched, he listened. Drinking at Stalin's table, it wasn't socializing. It was a test. And the wrong answer on that test, that could get you killed. Kim Jong-il was the largest single customer of the Hennessy cognac in the world. He spent between $650,000 and $800,000 a year on it. His favorite was Hennessy Paradis, which retails for well over $1,000 a bottle. The average North Korean earns a fraction of that in an entire year. When his doctors told him to stop drinking cognac around 1999, he didn't stop drinking. He switched to vintage Bordeaux and Burgundy. He would import bottles from France, and he ended up building a personal cellar of over 10,000 bottles. Now, his son, Kim Jong-un, continued the tradition. Cristal champagne was reportedly his favorite, and one source claimed he boasted about drinking 10 bottles of Bordeaux in a single night. What does all this tell us? I think it tells us that wine has never just been a simple drink. It's always been a symbol of taste, of status, of power, and sometimes the abuse of power. Jefferson used wine to build a vision of what America could be, a country with culture and refinement, not just revolution. Napoleon, he used it as a constant. It was the familiar thing in his life of chaos. Churchill used it as fuel, as pleasure, and friendship. The Nazis, they used it as plunder, and the modern dictators use it as a mark for their distance from the people they're supposed to serve. But here's what I keep coming back to. So every single wine in this episode, so Chambertin, Pol Roger, Lafite, Constantia, Hennessy Paradis, you can still drink them. They're not the same bottles, obviously, but they're the same wines from the same vineyards, made by the same families in some cases. In Napoleon Chambertin, it's still made in Gevrey Chambertin. You can buy a village level bottle for 40 or $50 and taste the grape that conquered Europe. Pol Roger Brut, it's available at almost every good wine shop. Constantia, it's still produced at the same estate in South Africa. These aren't museum pieces, they're actual living wines. And for me personally, I think that's kind of what makes wine different from every other luxury. It's a painting hanging behind glass, a palace with its velvet rope, but a bottle of wine, you open it and you pour it and you drink it just like the emperors and the presidents and the tyrants drank it too. The same sun, the same soil, the same grapes. And for a few minutes, history isn't just something to read about, it's something that you get to taste.